Well, it's not as common now, but when I was in about grade 6 or 7, I had a paper route, and that was my first job. It led to me opening my first bank account, and it was at Canada Trust, before it was TD Canada Trust. And I still remember you used to have those little booklets that you'd go and you'd feed into before you'd feed in the machine, they'd update your bank balances and all that. And so I had my first bank account. I had my first job delivering newspapers. It was the Hamilton Spectator, which was the biggest paper for our region because we lived near Hamilton, Ontario. And I remember delivering papers. I'd hand off. My friend actually gave me the job, and it was the best paper route in the area because it was right on my own street. So I would deliver the paper, and it was after school, so it wasn't like now some of the papers are, if you're getting Edmonton Journal or something, it's coming at 5 a.m. or something. So, grade 6ers probably can't do that one. But anyway, I delivered it after school, and it was an interesting job model because it was a real, basically the newspaper had hired all these teenage contractors because basically I bought the newspapers from them, and then I distributed them all, and then I had a little booklet that I'd go around and I'd collect money from all of the people who ordered the newspaper. So the subscriptions went through there, and they'd tell me where to deliver, but I had to go and, some people could prepay, but it wasn't back, right around 1989 or 90, everything, there was no online, right? There was no internet. You didn't pay for anything online. Some people paid ahead, which I didn't like as much, even though it meant I didn't have to go and collect. But sometimes people, when I'd go collect, they'd give me tips. So that was always actually why I liked to go and collect. And it was like a source of income whenever I needed money. So if there was a hockey game on or something in town and I wanted to go, or I just wanted to go to the store and get some snacks or something, I could just go and be like, oh, I'm going to go collect for Mrs. So-and-so. She owes me 2 weeks, and, oh, hi, yeah, I'm just collecting for the paper, and punch your card and get two weeks, all right, I got $5, let's go. I can go to the store. So I had a source of income whenever I wanted it, in a sense, but I had to pay for the papers. Well, there was a time when they wanted to add value to the customers, so we would deliver flyers, and they paid us a pittance. It was about 1 or 2 cents a flyer. And then for flyers, they wanted us to deliver to every house. So, in my whole route, there might have been 50 houses. I delivered about 35 newspapers, or maybe 60 houses. But then when it came to the day of flyers, and I remember the flyer was called Pennywise. It was called Pennywise. And I thought, oh, that's appropriate because that's about all I get paid for delivering these things. And they wanted me to deliver to every house. So I did sometimes, but then there were some times when I didn't really want to do that, or I was in a rush, or it was raining, or I wanted to play street hockey instead, so I'd get my paper route done, because those are paying customers, but to deliver flyers to every house, I was like, they're not going to miss it. So there was a couple of times when I hid the flyers. I thought, I'll get rid of them sometime in the future, so I had a barrel in the garage with my hockey sticks, and I actually dumped a couple of the flyers in the barrel at the bottom. And so, my parents weren't as observant to be like, how come the hockey sticks are up that high now? But I dumped them in there because I didn't want to do it. And then sometime later, Dad found them, and maybe it was Mom, but I think it was Dad. And so I got an inquiry. I faced an inquiry. What are these flyers doing in the hockey stick barrel? Well, I put them there. Why? Because I didn't want to do them. Well, that's not good. You've already been paid to deliver these. Well, it wasn't much. It was only like a cent, 1 penny a flyer, or 2 cents a flyer. Doesn't matter. That's stealing. So I didn't steal from anybody. Yeah, you got paid to do a job you didn't do. No, I didn't. I didn't steal anything. I didn't take any money from anybody. I didn't do, nope, that is not right. So then Dad made me go out and deliver the flyers, and they would have been like minimum 6 months old. Okay, so you would have been one of those people who opened up their mailbox and was like, Canadian Tire, September 2020. Well, that's odd. I wonder why so my whole neighborhood got like flyers from a year and a half ago or something like that because I was forced to go deliver them. And I also needed to go, I wrote a check back to the newspaper for the money that they had already paid me for the job I didn't do. So I had justified it in my mind, and I felt okay, but I was caught, and I was called on that one, and so I had to both deliver the flyers and write a check back to the paper and a letter describing what I did and apologizing for stealing from them, and so that was a lesson learned. I tell you, I still remember that. But as you get, at the time, I felt like my dad was torturing me, and it felt like the worst thing in the world, and I was so embarrassed, and I hated every second of it. But as an adult, with my own kids, I now realize, boy, that was a really important lesson. Because we all have this capacity within us to be able to justify things, don't we? We can justify just about anything we want, right? If it doesn't line up with what we want, we can justify not doing it. I mean, from the little things about speed limits, right? Or whether we're talking about bigger things, about credit cards or interests or traffic tickets or whatever it might be, we can justify so much if we really want to. And our brains do it like automatically. So in my mind, I hadn't done anything wrong. I didn't like it. I didn't think it was a good value. I didn't want to do it. I didn't deliver the flyers. But I was completely 100% in the wrong. But in my own mind, I had justified it and felt like I was okay with that. And so that's one of the dangers we all face is our own masterful ability to justify what we do or what we don't do. Now, I want to look at a text today from Luke chapter 10. We have been looking at the Great Commandments as it's listed in Matthew and in Mark. This core teaching is talked about in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called the Synoptic Gospels, all three of those. They have a little different context in each one, but basically the message wants to be conveyed. All of them want to tell us that the biggest commandments are love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. These are the greatest commandments. So in the context of Luke, it's different. It's a little different than Matthew and Mark. In Matthew and Mark, Jesus says these words. Someone asks Jesus a question, and he declares, these are the greatest commandments. In Luke, it's a little bit different. So I want to read for you from Luke. It's a little bit more of a controversy where there's an expert in the law that we are told in Luke chapter 10, verse 25. So let's do Luke chapter 10, and I'll start at verse 25. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. So Luke is attributing motive here. This man stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus throws the question back to him, like a good rabbi. What is written in the law, and how do you read it? He answered, love the Lord. So the expert in the law is now answering with these words. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. This is an interesting phrase now in verse 29. But he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, Well, who's my neighbor? So it's interesting because Luke seems to know the motive of this guy, or he's attributing it, right? So the expert is asking this question because he wants to test Jesus. Now he's saying this guy responds because Jesus had a good teaching moment, let the guy say the commandments, and agreed with him and said, do this and you will live. Now the expert wants to justify himself. Uh-oh. When we want to justify ourselves, we've got to watch out. So he asked Jesus, who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, they beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road when he saw the man, and he passed by on the other side. Now I'll just pause for a moment. Part of the reason why the priest passed by on the other side is because a priest was only allowed by God's law, the priest was only supposed to bury their own close relatives. Otherwise, they're considered unclean. Anytime a person touched another dead body, they're considered unclean, and they had to go through a 7-day purification. Now, there's practicality to this. Anybody who's involved with the medical community knows, like there's disease, there's things. So really, it's, even if you see a dead bird or squirrel or something, you're telling your kids, don't touch it. You don't want to do that. So there was procedures. But for a priest, it was particularly notable because they had a job to do each week to stand before God and represent the people. And so they were only allowed to help and bury their own closest relatives. So the priest passes by on the other side because he doesn't want to be unclean or defiled. He doesn't want to be made dirty so he can't do his job, which is to serve the Lord. So too, let's continue, 32. A Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. Again, just to pause, this was a notoriously bad road. Jerusalem to Jericho, Jerusalem is way up high on a mountain, and Jericho is something like 800 to 1,000 feet below sea level. It's the lowest city in the world. And so it's a windy path. I was known for robbers and ambushes. And even today, there's still thieves that do the same sort of tactic. They were on the side of the road. They're like, someone's coming. Hey, can you help me? My car, it's broke down. I just need a hand. And then all of a sudden, boom, and someone's pouncing on you. And that's the type of thing that happened on the road. So they could easily have somebody lying on the side, and just pretending they're hurt. And then if some good-willing, good-natured person stops to help, all of a sudden, bam, they're in trouble and ambushed, and they're sunk. So that happens, and it happened back then too. So again, for the Levite, another religious person with rituals and duties, passed as well. Maybe he was afraid of being mugged. We don't know. But a Samaritan, and this is really a big deal for the Jewish audience. The Samaritans Jews considered them half-bloods, half-breeds. It was very offensive. Samaritans were dirty. They were not the people of God. Way back in their history, and I explained it some time ago, but back in the history, they were one people. But when the Israelites were taken into exile after the northern and southern kingdoms were defeated, some remnant stayed, and they held on to their faith. And that was what became the Samaritans. Then when the people returned from exile, and they returned to Jerusalem, they considered the people who had never left to be impure and not true Jews. They weren't full. They couldn't trace their lineage in the same way. And so they were imposters. And the Samaritans believed in Moses and the law, but they didn't really go by all the prophets and other things that the Jews held to be their scriptures. So there was a deep divide like only family can breed. right? This wasn't just neighbors with differences of opinion. This was like, it did run deep, and there were bloodlines. And so it was a deep offense, and that's why people would travel around Samaria. They didn't want to go through. Samaritans hated Jews, and Jews hated Samaritans. And you'd be more likely to be attacked if you were in the other person's territory. So a lot of times Jews would travel around and take a much longer journey so they didn't have to go through, even though Samaria was a much more direct route. So, that said, a Samaritan, a despised, half-breed, dirty person that we all love to hate, a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, took pity on him. And he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. Then the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, and said, "Look after him, and when I return I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Which of these 3, Jesus then puts the question to the expert, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Note, he couldn't say Samaritan. The disdain is so deep, he won't even acknowledge that it was a Samaritan who was the hero of a story. A Samaritan cannot be a hero of a story. That was the kind of thinking. Doesn't happen. So he said, the one who showed mercy. And Jesus said, okay, go and do likewise. So the interesting thing here that I wanted to highlight is that giving the right answer is different than living the right answer. Okay, giving the right answer is different than living the right answer. This expert in the law tests Jesus, and 2 times he gives the right answer. The first time, Jesus says, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." There's a distinction, right? Your answer was right. You gave the right answer, but you need to live it in order to really give the right answer. So giving the right answer is different than living the right answer. The same in the end. This is the crux. After all of that, Jesus says, go and do likewise. Go and do it. You answered correctly. Go and do it. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's interesting as well because Jesus puts these things together, right? That loving God and loving our neighbor are brought together in this. That there's really no separation. That in order to love God, we have to love our neighbor. Now, we've explored it a little bit in the last couple of weeks, what it means to love God, what it looks like. There are elements there that are important and we need to follow, but in the end, what Jesus is doing is lifting up this second command to say, the second is like it, what he says in Matthew. The first command is love God with your totality, with all you have. And the second is like the first, by saying it right after another. He's saying you can't separate them. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's critical. You can't have one without the other. There was no doubt that the priest and the Levite loved God. It was shown in their devotion to the law. This expert in the law would have been one of those people. The priest followed the law. The expert in the law asked the question because he wanted to justify himself. But that's the difference, right? It's the idea of, what can I get away with? What can I get away with? He wanted to justify himself. He didn't want to live compassionately. He wanted to live by the law. He wanted to avoid doing what he didn't want to do. And we all know how to do that, right? And sometimes we even use God against God. right? Like that's what these guys were doing. The priest is using God's law in order so that he doesn't have to have the heart of God. He doesn't want to have the compassion that God has for people, so he'll go kind of hide behind the law. No, God, I did the law. I did all of those things, all the rules. I followed all the rules. But they miss what God is really saying, that loving your neighbor is loving God. And in Matthew's version, he even said, on these two commands, all of the law and the prophets hang. So if you want to say you're a law follower, and that's how you want to follow God, guess what? When you love God and love your neighbor as yourself, you're covered. You're covered. When Jesus talks with his disciples, he says, a new command I give to you. That's what the New Testament is. It's a new command, a new covenant, a new command. Love one another. That's a new command. So he's changing it to say, rather than honoring God by just, now he doesn't say ignore the law. He doesn't say throw the law out or it doesn't matter. There's many things that God, many principles and rules, things that God has laid out that we do need to follow. And that's part of how we love him. But don't ever think that by obeying God's rules, you have done your duty and fulfilled it. Jesus said that is no longer the case. Actually, it was never the case, but let me just make it clear. That is not the case now that I've come. The kingdom of God is here. And if you're going to live in it, if you're going to live by its rules, love one another. Love your neighbor as yourself. Because giving the right answer is different than living the right answer. I was reminded of the parable as well that Jesus told of the two sons who were told to go to work. And the one son said, "Yes, Father," and then he went off and played for the day. And the other son said, "No way," and then felt bad and then decided to go and do the work that the father had asked him to do. And then Jesus asked, which one did the will of the Father? The one that said yes and ignored it, or the one that said no and then did it? The answer is the one that said no, but then did it. Sometimes we get so removed of this in the church, and we get really churchy about things, and we can argue about doctrine and what that one believes or what we believe or this or that. Man, God is way more practical than we usually give credit for in church. It's important to know what God says, but it's more important to do what God does. How are we loving? Are we loving? Are we loving our neighbor as ourselves? And your neighbor, by this story, the summary of it is basically your neighbor is anyone in need with whom you're thrown into contact. Okay, so someone that you have contact with, wasn't planned even, but if they're in real need, that's your neighbor. It doesn't have to be somebody who lives in your neighborhood. So Jesus really has a pretty wide definition of neighbor here. And I think that's kind of scary. Now, I don't want to really give much. I always am a little bit hesitant to go here because we can justify ourselves so easily when it comes to it. But I think we do have to just pause for a minute and say, does this mean that we have to respond to every request that we ever receive in the affirmative? And I would say no. But be careful, because all of a sudden you're ready to check out. You're like, oh, good. That means I don't have to do it. Like that's our first, we want to be like, give me an excuse. I want to get out of this. I don't want to actually have to do this. So do we have to, must we respond in the affirmative to every request? And I would say no, but God is likely calling you to do more than you're currently doing. How about I say that? Here's the key. Inconvenience is not an acceptable justification before God. Inconvenience doesn't cut it. Oh, you know what? Yes, that person's really in need, but I got to get to my appointment. Or I've got a roast in the oven. Or I've got we got to get home. The kids got to get to bed. Inconvenience doesn't cut it. It's not an acceptable justification before God to not love your neighbor. Right? Because the story just told goes way beyond inconvenient for the Good Samaritan. So, what do we do? Well, we do need to assess the need. I would just say a couple of things. Assess the need. Is this a real need or is it a perceived need? Again, perception is subjective, but oftentimes the person in the middle of the crisis feels the weight of the crisis and it's the biggest deal to them. In their world, it is. But that's where your calm head and your separateness can hopefully bring some calm to their anxiety. But is the need real or perceived? I would say observe. Bring your skills of observation to what's happening in this person or situation. What's going on? We know that even in our town, we have things and schemes that happen where, hey, could you give me a lift? I just need to go here. Well, sometimes that's the case. But there's other times where, hey, could you give me a lift? I just need to go here. Oh, and I need to pick up my cousin. Oh, and I need to get this. And I'm just getting a couple of groceries. And then when I come running out with a giant TV and throw it in the back of your truck, let's just go. Like, wait a minute. Okay, so observe. Sometimes people really do need something. Other times, there's other factors at play. So use your discernment. When in doubt, pray. Ask questions of God. God, should I be engaged in this right now? And if not, please make it really clear to me. And if you have an uneasy spirit or something that's not right, listen to it. Ask questions of the person in need. Sometimes that happens too. You ask a couple of questions and you find out pretty quickly, their whole story just crumbles. Like, they'll have a really nice story to tell you about their need and why you need to give them this right now, and without it, how their whole life is going to collapse because they've made horrible decisions for the last 10 years, but right now you are the only person who can save me. Well, ask some questions. Maybe there's something you can do. But the Samaritan didn't save the man for the rest of his life. Maybe one of the things is to suggest alternative ways to meet their need. Maybe the way they think their need needs to be met isn't the way that you can meet it right now. Or there's an alternative. How about you're saying you need money? What if I bought you lunch? You said you need money for coffee. What if I gave you a Tim card? You said you need this. What if I could provide that thing for you? What if I could direct you to a place that could help you for long term? Well, sometimes, no. I only need this one thing that I'm telling you for right now. Okay, well, I guess we're not able to help you out in that way. Try to think of long-term solutions. So, I want us to be able to assess the need, to ask a few questions, work through some of these things, because the ease of it is to say that's really inconvenient, or I'm afraid and I'm not going to do anything. And I don't think that that's the point of this story. I think loving God and loving neighbor is challenging. That's the point. Jesus is changing things. He said, my kingdom is different. My kingdom has come and is coming, and I want you to love differently than everyone else. Everyone else says, that's really inconvenient, and I don't even care, and I don't even know you, so get lost. Christians say, because God loves me, and I've been transformed by God's love when I didn't deserve it, I'm going to love other people because I love God. And God's love lives in me, and I want it to live through me, and I'm called to be Jesus' hands and feet. And the way that I live really demonstrates God's kingdom on this earth. And so when people experience me and the help that I can bring and the encouraging words and whatever it is that I can bring and offer, they experience God. Jesus even said, when you give a cup of cold water to those in my name, you give it to me. Well, that's not a big deal, eh? But it's accepted as a sacrifice, as a gift unto the Lord. And we're called to be living sacrifices, to live out this sacrifice that He's called us to. So I just wanted to explore. We do need discernment. There are real dangers in our world, and we do need to be careful. But we cannot just write everything off as dangerous or inconvenient all the time. We do need to discern. Am I picking up hitchhikers when I have my wife and kids in a full van? No. But might I consider it? I have a friend who's a single guy, drives around our area all the time, and he said, you know what? I've started picking up hitchhikers. He said, I pray before each one. I pray for them. I often will pray for them in the car or ask him if I can. And if I have a knot in my gut or in my spirit, I don't do it. But he's like, I trust the Lord to lead me, and I'm doing that. So that might not be what you're called to do. That's fine. Maybe you help in other ways and in other forms. Maybe we're not even talking about hitchhikers. We're talking about anybody in need that you come into proximity with is categorized as your neighbor. It doesn't mean you have to meet every need, but be careful, because your default and my default is to justify very quickly, I don't need to do that. They're not with me, I don't need to, I can ignore it. But that's the way of the world, isn't it? Remember, living the right answer is better than giving the right answer. What it comes down to is the condition of the heart. Are we living for ourselves, or is Christ living His life through us? That's what we're called to, to let Jesus live in and through us. The Spirit of God can do that. Have our lives been transformed by the rules, or has our heart been transformed by the Spirit of God? And there's a different thing, right? And all throughout our church experiences, we see different modes. There's a mode of imposing rules upon people and saying, you must live within these rules. That's the way to honor God. Rules. Follow the rules. Obey the rules. That's why a lot of times people think, I don't need church. I don't really want more rules in my life. Or there's the other way of saying, when God really gets a hold of your heart, and we are willing to submit and repent and learn to love the way God's called us to love, we end up following the rules. Not because we're trying to follow every rule, because you can see even in the story, the guys who followed the rules to the T missed the heart of God. They missed it. And what Jesus is saying, if you follow the heart of God, you're going to keep the rules. So what are you going to put first, rules or love? Rules or love. And it's hard. And we have to learn this. Okay, it's not easy to love others. It's not. We have to allow the Lord to change our hearts. It's interesting. I heard an observation that said, when Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 13 about love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast. Why would he write that? Well, because if we're honest, we are not kind. We do envy. We do boast. We do keep records of wrongs. We are impatient, aren't we? Like when we allow ourselves to be honest, you're like, we need to be reminded. No, here's what love is. It is patient and kind. And it doesn't do these things. And we need to be reminded because our natural tendency is to live there. There's a story of a hospital visitor. There was a mom who was in her late stages of cancer who was isolated for some reason. It wasn't a communicable disease, but was isolated in a room and was nearing the very end of life. And at that time, the nurse who was attending to this lady was recognizing what was happening, and this was happening fast. She felt like, okay, and the mother was calling for her son. And so the nurse came out and grabbed the person that the male that was waiting around in the waiting room and brought him in and said, yeah, here. And so gave him the hand and so said, you can do this, here you can sit, pulled up a chair. And they began this conversation and just kind of holding hands. And the mom couldn't see very well, but was able to talk and be reassured. And they stayed together throughout the whole night. And come the early hours of the morning, the mother passed away. And so the young man stood up and called for the nurse, buzzed, hey, she's passed away. And the nurse began to console him and say, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for your loss. And the young man was like, yeah, that's sad. Who was that? And she said, wasn't that your mom? And he said, no. Well, how come you stayed here all night? Well, because I could see quickly that she needed a son. She had been calling for her son, and he was willing to stay there all night in spite of not being related. That's a neighbor, friends. That's loving their neighbor as herself. And that's what we're called to. We can't love God with all we have and ignore our neighbors in need.